The dust hung thick in the air of Redemption Creek that September evening in 1873, and nobody in town could have predicted what was about to unfold at the Silver Spur Saloon. Jacob Thornhill sat at his usual corner table, boots propped up on a chair, counting the money he'd won at cards earlier that day. He was a handsome man, the kind who knew it and used it, with slicked black hair and a smile that could charm a rattlesnake out of its skin. But beneath that smile lived something cold, something that took pleasure in watching others suffer. And tonight he was about to make the biggest mistake of his 28 years. The saloon doors swung open, and in stumbled an old man wearing a threadbare coat that had once been fine wool, but now hung on him like moth-eaten curtains. His white hair stuck out in wild directions, and his beard was stained with whiskey and road dust. He clutched a leather-bound journal against his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. The old man's name was Silas Moreland, though most folks just called him the Wandering Poet when they called him anything at all. Jacob looked up from his money and grinned at his companion. Well, well, looks like the circus came to town and forgot one of its performers. The men at Jacob's table laughed, encouraged by his confidence. Silas shuffled to the bar, seemingly oblivious to the mockery, and placed 2 pennies on the scarred wooden surface. "Whiskey," he said in a voice that sounded like wind through canyon stones, old and weathered, but carrying something deeper underneath. "You sure you need more?" Jacob called out loudly enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Looks like you've had your fill for the week already." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Even the bartender, Tom Hadley, cracked a small smile, though something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with where this might be heading. Tom had run the Silver Spur for 15 years, and he'd learned to read trouble the way some men read newspapers. Silas took his whiskey, turned slowly, and fixed Jacob with eyes that were clearer than they had any right to be. They were the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, gray and heavy, with something that made Jacob's smile falter for just a moment. "You have kind eyes, young man," Silas said, his words not slurred at all despite his disheveled appearance. "It's a shame they're attached to such a cruel tongue." Jacob's face flushed red. Nobody spoke to him that way, especially not some vagrant poet who probably couldn't afford a decent meal. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Cruel? Old man, I'm the kindest person you'll meet in this town. I'm about to give you some free advice. Take your scribbling and your stink out of here before I have someone escort you out." "I write truths," Silas said calmly, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Would you like to hear one?" "I'd like to hear you apologize for wasting the air the rest of us breathe." The saloon had gone quiet now. Even the piano player had stopped, his hands frozen above the keys. This kind of confrontation could go bad quickly, and everyone knew it. But Silas just smiled, and it was a sad smile, the kind a father gives a son who's about to learn a hard lesson. "You're not ready for truth," Silas said, "but truth has a way of finding us whether we're ready or not." He finished his whiskey in one swallow, set the glass down with a soft clink, and walked toward the door. Jacob couldn't let it end there. His pride was a living thing inside him, demanding satisfaction. "That's right, run away, just like you've been running your whole pathetic life, writing pretty words because you're too weak to do anything real." Silas stopped at the doorway. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly through the silent room. "There's a church at the north end of town, old stone building with a bell tower. Tomorrow morning you should visit it. Bring a mirror." "Why would I do that?" Jacob sneered. "Because you'll want to see what everyone else sees when they look at you." And with that, the old poet walked out into the night, leaving behind a silence so complete you could hear the oil lamps flickering in their brackets. Jacob forced a laugh, trying to break the tension. Crazy old fool. Someone should run him out of town. But nobody laughed with him this time. Tom, the bartender, wiped down a glass and wouldn't meet Jacob's eyes. The poker players studied their cards with unusual intensity, and in the corner, Margaret Reeves, who ran the general store and was known for her straight talk and sharper sense, watched Jacob with an expression that might have been pity. Jacob threw some coins on the table and stormed out, angry that the evening's entertainment had left him feeling unsettled rather than triumphant. He walked back to his boarding house on the east side of town, his boots echoing on the wooden sidewalks. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows that seemed to follow him a little too closely for comfort. He didn't sleep well that night. His dreams were full of strange images, stone faces weeping, words carved in rock that he couldn't quite read, and those storm-gray eyes watching him from every shadow. When he woke up, it was still dark, the hour before dawn. dawn when the world holds its breath. And despite everything in him saying not to, despite his pride and his anger, and his certainty that the old poet was just a crazy drunk, Jacob found himself getting dressed and walking toward the north end of town. The Church of the Sacred Promise stood where it had for 40 years, built by the town's founders from gray stone quarried in the nearby mountains. It was a simple building with a bell tower that reached toward the sky like a finger pointing at heaven. Jacob had been inside maybe twice in his life, both times for funerals of people he barely knew. He wasn't a religious man. He believed in cards, whiskey, and his own cleverness, and none of those required a church. The eastern sky was just starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn as Jacob approached. The building looked different in this light, somehow older and more solid, like it had been there long before the town and would remain long after. He told himself he was just here to prove the old fool wrong, to have a laugh about it later. But his hands were shaking slightly, and not from the morning cold. He walked up the 3 stone steps to the heavy wooden door and tried the handle. It was unlocked, which surprised him. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo forever in the pre-dawn stillness. Inside, the church smelled of old wood and stone, candle wax, and something else, something like the air after a lightning strike, sharp and charged with potential. Morning light was just beginning to filter through the simple glass windows, casting long shadows across the wooden pews. Jacob walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps loud in the empty space. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. The old man's words had been vague, probably deliberately so. Bring a mirror. What kind of nonsense was that? But then he reached the front of the church, where a simple altar stood beneath a wooden cross, and he saw it. On the wall to the left of the altar, where there had always been blank gray stone, there was now a face. His face. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't painted. It wasn't a poster or a photograph somehow stuck to the wall. The face was carved into the stone itself, every line and curve rendered with impossible detail, as if the stone had grown that way naturally. His own features stared back at him from the wall, but they weren't quite right. This version of Jacob Thornhill's face showed something that mirrors never captured. The cruelty he worked so hard to hide behind charm and smiles was laid bare in that stone face. The coldness in those carved eyes, the slight sneer to those stone lips, the pride and contempt etched into every lineament. It was him, but it was the truth of him, the version that lived inside where no one else could see. And beneath the carved face, in letters that looked like they'd been written by someone with perfect control, were words cut into the stone. Here stands the face of Jacob Thornhill, who mocked truth and scorned mercy. Let all who see remember that what we hide in darkness, stone reveals in light. Jacob's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the floor, unable to tear his eyes away from that terrible, truthful portrait. His first thought was that this was impossible. Stone couldn't be carved overnight, not with that level of detail. His second thought was that someone was playing an elaborate trick on him, though he couldn't imagine who or how. His third thought, the one that made his stomach turn over, was that the old poet had done exactly what he'd promised. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Father Michael O'Connor, the church's elderly priest, stood in the doorway that led to his small residence behind the sanctuary. The old priest had been part of Redemption Creek for as long as anyone could remember, a gentleman with soft Irish accent and eyes that had seen both the best and worst of humanity. He looked at Jacob on the floor, then at the wall, and his expression didn't change at all. No surprise, no shock, just a deep sadness. You've seen it then, Father O'Connor said quietly. You knew. Jacob's voice came out as a croak. How is this possible? The priest walked slowly down the aisle and sat in the front pew, his old bones creaking almost as loudly as the wood. I found it this morning when I came to prepare for services. At first, I thought perhaps I was still dreaming. But no, it's real enough. Stone doesn't lie, Jacob. Never has, never will. But it's impossible. Nobody can carve stone like that in one night. Nobody. Ah, but Silas Moreland isn't nobody, is he? The priest looked at the carved face with something like reverence. Do you know who he really is, lad? Do you know the story? Jacob shook his head, still staring at his own face, judging him from the wall. Father O'Connor sighed. Then I'll tell you because you need to understand what you've done. Silas Moreland was once the most celebrated sculptor in all of Europe. His work graced cathedrals and palaces. Kings and popes commissioned him. They said his hands could make stone breathe, could capture the soul of a person so perfectly that the marble was more alive than the flesh. But 30 years ago, something happened. His only daughter, a beautiful girl named Catherine, fell in love with a man who seemed charming and kind. But he wasn't, you see. He was cruel behind that charm. And when she discovered his true nature, when she tried to leave him, the priest paused, choosing his words carefully. He took her from this world. Jacob felt ice forming in his chest. Silas couldn't save her. He was too late. And something broke in him that day. Something fundamental. He left Europe, left everything behind, and started wandering. He carries that journal you saw last night. In it, he writes poetry, yes, but he also sketches. And sometimes, when he encounters someone whose outer face doesn't match their inner truth, when he sees cruelty hiding behind charm, Father O'Connor gestured at the wall. Sometimes the stone remembers his gift. Sometimes it shows what he's seen. That's madness, Jacob whispered, but without conviction. Is it? Look at that carving, Jacob. Look at it closely. Every tool mark, every chisel line. It's all perfect, but there are no fresh stone chips on the floor, no dust. It's as if the stone always had your face in it, and Silas simply revealed what was already there. Jacob finally managed to tear his eyes away from the wall. He looked at the priest desperately. Can it be removed? Can you chip it away, plaster over it? We tried, Father O'Connor said sadly. Tom Hadley brought his best tools first thing this morning, soon as I sent word. The stone won't take a mark. It's as hard as diamond where your face is carved, but the rest of the wall is still ordinary stone. No, Jacob, this is permanent. The full weight of it hit Jacob then. This wasn't going to go away. By noon, everyone in town would know. They'd all come to see it, to stare at the face that showed what Jacob Thornhill really was beneath all his charm and smiles. The mockery he'd so casually dealt out to others would be returned to him 1,000-fold. He'd be a laughingstock, a cautionary tale, the man whose true face was written in stone for all eternity. Where is he? Jacob asked. Where's Silas? Gone. He left before dawn. I saw him walking west on the old mountain trail. Just a shadow against the stars. Father O'Connor stood up slowly. But I don't think finding him would change anything. This isn't about revenge, lad. It's about truth. And truth, once revealed, can't be hidden again. Jacob didn't remember leaving the church. He found himself walking through town as the sun rose fully, painting everything gold and red. People were starting to emerge from their homes, beginning their daily routines. And so soon they'd hear, they'd come to see, and they'd know. He thought about running, about saddling his horse and riding as far as he could. But where would he go? The story would follow him, a face carved in stone, appearing overnight in a church wall. That was the kind of tale that spread like wildfire across the territories. He'd be famous, for all the wrong reasons. By mid-morning the crowd had gathered. Jacob watched from the window of his boarding house as what looked like half the town made their way to the Church of the Sacred Promise. He saw Margaret Reeves walking with her husband. He saw the men he'd played cards with the night before. He saw children being lifted up to see, their parents pointing and speaking in hushed, serious tones. What surprised him was that the mockery he expected didn't materialize, at least not in the cruel way he'd feared. People were stunned, certainly. Some were frightened, but mostly they seemed thoughtful. He watched as people stood before the carving, their faces grave, and then turned to look at each other differently, as if wondering what their own faces might look like if stone revealed their truths. Around noon there was a knock at Jacob's door. He almost didn't answer, but something made him open it. Margaret Reeves stood there alone, holding a basket covered with a cloth. "Mrs. Reeves," Jacob said, unable to meet her eyes. "May I come in, Jacob?" He stepped aside, and she entered his small, sparse room. She set the basket on the table and uncovered it, revealing bread, cheese, and apples. "You haven't eaten today, I'd wager." "I'm not hungry." "Eat anyway. You need your strength for what comes next." Jacob laughed bitterly. "And what's that? Public humiliation? Exile?" Margaret sat down in his only chair and looked at him steadily. She was a woman in her 50s, weathered by frontier life, but with a kindness in her eyes that age hadn't diminished. "What comes next is the hard part. Living with truth. We all hide things, Jacob. Every single person in this town has parts of themselves they'd rather not see reflected back. You're not unique in that. What's unique is that you've been given something most people never get, a perfect mirror held up by circumstance that you can't look away from. I'm ruined, he said flatly. Are you? Or are you free? She leaned forward. I've known you since you came to Redemption Creek 3 years ago. I've watched you charm and manipulate, watched you use people and discard them. I've seen the hurt you leave in your wake. But I've also seen moments, rare ones, where something better shows through. A kindness you quickly hide, a moment of genuine connection you immediately deflect with a joke. You've been at war with yourself, Jacob, and now the war is visible. That's terrifying, yes, but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To become someone different, to let that face on the wall be a memorial to who you were, not a prophecy of who you'll always be. She stood up. The choice is yours. You can run from it, let it define you, become exactly what that carving shows, or you can look at it every day and decide to prove it wrong. After she left, Jacob sat alone with the food she'd brought, unable to eat but grateful for the gesture. He thought about her words. He thought about Silas Moreland, carrying the weight of his daughter's end for 30 years, channeling his grief and gift into these strange acts of revelation. He thought about Catherine, the sculptor's daughter, who'd seen past a charming exterior too late. And for the first time in his life, Jacob Thornhill felt something he'd never experienced before. Genuine shame, not embarrassment at being caught, not anger at being judged, but true shame at who he'd become. That evening, as the sun set and long shadows stretched across Redemption Creek, Jacob did something he'd never done voluntarily. He walked to the Church of the Sacred Promise, entered through the heavy wooden door, and sat in the front pew, directly facing his stone portrait. Father O'Connor was there, lighting candles for evening prayers. He saw Jacob but said nothing, just nodded and continued his quiet work. Jacob sat there for an hour, just looking at his own face carved in stone. He studied every cruel line, every hint of the coldness that had driven his actions for so many years, and slowly, painfully, he began to recognize not just what was there, but why. The charm was armor against vulnerability. The cruelty was a way to feel powerful when he felt weak inside. The mockery of others was his way of avoiding looking at himself. When Father O'Connor finished lighting the candles, he came and sat beside Jacob. They sat in silence for a while, the candlelight flickering across the stone face. "I was 12 when my father left," Jacob finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He just walked away one morning. Never came back. My mother told me it was because I wasn't good enough, that if I'd been a better son, he'd have stayed. I spent my whole life trying to prove I was better than everyone else, trying to make sure no one could leave me because I'd leave them first. And now," the priest asked gently, "now I see that I became exactly what I hated. I've been leaving people behind, hurting them before they could hurt me for 15 years. Jacob's voice cracked. "That face on the wall isn't wrong, Father. That's exactly who I am." "Who you were," Father O'Connor corrected quietly. "The stone shows what was true and it was carved. But truth isn't static, Jacob. But people change. The question is, do you want to?" Jacob looked at the carved face, really looked at it, and made a decision that terrified him more than anything in his life. "Yes," he said, "I want to try." The days that followed were the hardest of Jacob's life. He didn't run. He stayed in Redemption Creek, and every morning he went to the church and sat before his stone portrait. Sometimes other people were there, coming to see the miracle or mystery or whatever they called it. Jacob endured their stares, their whispers, their questions. Some people were cruel, throwing his past actions back in his face, but more were curious or thoughtful or surprisingly supportive. Tom Hadley, the bartender, came to him with a proposition. "I need help fixing up the back room at the Saloon. It's hard work, doesn't pay much, but it's honest. You interested?" Jacob was surprised. After everything?" Tom shrugged. "Everyone needs a second chance. Question is whether you'll take it or waste it." Jacob took it. He worked hard, harder than he'd ever worked at anything. His hands got blistered and calloused. His back ached. But there was something clean about the work, something honest. And Tom, despite his gruff exterior, turned out to be a patient teacher. Margaret Reeves gave him a different kind of work, making amends. She gave him a list of people he'd wronged over the past 3 years, people he'd cheated at cards, people he'd mocked or manipulated. Start at the top, she told him firmly. Apologize, make restitution where you can, and mean it. That was even harder than the physical labor. Facing people he'd hurt, admitting what he'd done, asking forgiveness without any guarantee he'd receive it, it stripped away every defense he'd ever built. Some people slammed doors in his face. Some told him to leave town and never come back. But others, more than he expected, listened, and a few, like Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, and whom Jacob had once cheated out of a week's wages, actually accepted his apology and his repayment. "We all carry burdens," Mrs. Chen told him in her accented English. "Yours just happens to be carved in stone, but stone can be foundation, not just monument. You understand?" He was beginning to. Weeks turned into months. The carved face remained unchanging, a permanent fixture of the church. People came from neighboring towns to see it. Some called it a miracle, others a curse, still others a hoax, despite all evidence to the contrary. But Jacob stopped caring what they called it. He had his own name for it now, his beginning. One cold November morning, 6 weeks after that fateful night in the saloon, Jacob was working on repairing a fence behind the church. Father O'Connor had quietly started finding work for him, too, when he heard a familiar voice. "You're doing good work." Jacob turned to see Father O'Connor standing there, but he wasn't alone. Next to him stood a woman in her mid-30s with kind eyes and practical clothes. She looked vaguely familiar, though Jacob couldn't place her. "Thank you, Father," Jacob said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the chill. "I want you to meet someone," the priest said. "This is Sarah Mitchell. She's been running a school for children in Silverton, 3 towns west. She's considering starting one here in Redemption Creek." Sarah extended her hand and Jacob shook it, confused about why he was being introduced. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Father O'Connor tells me you've been helping out around town," Sarah said. "Fixing things, doing odd jobs. I'm trying to make amends for past wrongs, ma'am." "Yes, I've heard the story. The whole territory has heard the story, I think." She looked at him thoughtfully. "I need someone to help build the schoolhouse. Someone who's good with their hands and isn't afraid of hard work. Father O'Connor suggested you might be interested." Jacob was stunned. "You'd trust me? After everything?" Sarah smiled. "Trust is earned, Mr. Thornhill, but everyone deserves a chance to earn it. What do you say?" He said yes. Of course he said yes. The schoolhouse project took 3 months. Jacob worked alongside Sarah and a crew of townspeople who volunteered their time. He learned carpentry, not just the crude repairs he'd been doing, but real craftsmanship. Sarah turned out to be a patient but exacting teacher. She demanded quality work, and she wouldn't accept shortcuts or half measures. But she also talked to him while they worked, asked him about his life, his thoughts, his plans. She told him about her own past, about mistakes she'd made and lessons she'd learned. She'd lost her husband to fever 2 years earlier and had thrown herself into teaching as a way to process her grief. "We all have to find meaning in our suffering," she told him one afternoon as they fitted window frames. "Otherwise, it just destroys us." Sully. During those 3 months, something shifted in how the town viewed Jacob. Oh, the carved face was still there. It would always be there. People still brought visitors to see it, still told the story, but increasingly they also told the rest of the story. How Jacob had stayed, how he'd worked to change, how he'd faced his own worst self and chosen to become something different. On the day the schoolhouse was completed, the whole town turned out for the dedication. Father O'Connor blessed the building. Sarah gave a speech about the importance of education. And then, to Jacob's complete surprise, Margaret Reeves called him forward. "This young man," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "has done something remarkable. Not the stone face in the church that was done to him. No, what's remarkable is what he's done since. He's faced his shame, owned his mistakes, and worked every single day to become someone better. That's the real story we should be telling. That's the real miracle." The crowd applauded, and Jacob felt tears stinging his eyes. He looked around at the faces watching him, some still skeptical, some supportive, all of them seeing him, really seeing him. Not the charm, not the mask, but the person beneath, flaws and all. That night, Jacob walked to the church one more time. He stood before his stone portrait in the empty sanctuary, candlelight dancing across those cruel carved features. The face hadn't changed, it never would, but as he looked at it now, he felt something different. Not shame anymore, or at least not only shame. He felt gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly to Silas Moreland, wherever the wandering sculptor might be. "Thank you for showing me the truth." He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Sarah Mitchell entering the church. She came and stood beside him, looking up at the carved face. "Does it still haunt you?" she asked. "Every day," Jacob admitted, "but not in the way it used to. Now it reminds me where I've been, how far I've come, how far I still have to go." Sarah smiled. "Good. The day we stop seeing our flaws is the day we stop growing." She hesitated, then added, "I'm planning to stay in Redemption Creek. The school is doing well, and I think I've found a home here. I was wondering if you might consider staying too. I could use an assistant at the school. Someone who understands what it means to start over." Jacob looked at her, seeing the genuine offer in her eyes, the acceptance. "You'd want that, even knowing everything?" "Especially knowing everything. You've proven you can change, Jacob. That's worth more than a perfect past." Spring came to Redemption Creek with wildflowers covering the hills and the promise of new beginnings in the air. Jacob Thornhill took the position at the school, working with children who didn't care about his past, who only knew him as Mr. Thornhill, the kind man who fixed broken things and told funny stories, and never ever mocked anyone for trying and failing. He and Sarah grew closer, slowly, carefully, building something real on a foundation of honesty. She knew exactly who he'd been, and she chose to see who he was becoming. That was worth more than any charm or deception could ever have gotten him. The carved face remained in the church, a permanent part of Redemption Creek's history. Over the years, it became something different than what Jacob had feared. Instead of a mark of shame, it became a symbol of transformation. People would bring their children to see it, and they'd tell them the story, not just of the cruel man who mocked a poet, but of what happened after. They'd tell them that truth, while painful, can also be liberating. That facing our worst selves is the first step to becoming our best selves. Years later, when Redemption Creek had grown into a proper town with a railroad station and a proper hospital, when Jacob and Sarah were married with children of their own, visitors still came to see the face in the church wall. And Jacob, now in his 40s with silver threading through his black hair, would sometimes take people to see it himself. "That's me," he'd say simply, pointing to the cruel stone face. "That's who I was." And people would look at him, seeing the kindness in his eyes, the genuine warmth in his smile, the way he held his daughter's hand or spoke gently to his students, and they'd understand the real message that Silas Moreland had left carved in stone. Not that we're defined by our worst moments, but that those moments can define what we choose to become. On a cool evening in late autumn, nearly 5 years after the face had appeared, Jacob was closing up the school when he saw a figure walking down the main street of town. Even from a distance, even bent with age, Jacob recognized the gait. His heart began to pound. Silas Moreland had returned. The old poet moved slowly, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his white hair even more wild than before, his clothes even more threadbare. But those storm-gray eyes were as sharp as ever. He saw Jacob and stopped, waiting. Jacob walked toward him, his mind racing with 1,000 things he wanted to say. When he stood before the old sculptor, he found himself speechless. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you." Silas studied him for a long moment, those piercing eyes seeing everything, missing nothing. Then, slowly, a genuine smile crossed his weathered face. "You've changed." "Because of what you showed me." "No," Silas said gently. "I only revealed what was there. You did the changing. That was all you, Jacob Thornhill." "I hated you for a long time," Jacob admitted, "but I understand now. Your daughter, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what happened to her, and I'm sorry that I reminded you of the man who hurt her." Silas's eyes grew wet. "You didn't just remind me. You were him, in every way that mattered. The same charm, the same cruelty underneath. When you mocked me that night, I saw his face, and I couldn't let it pass. I've spent 30 years trying to prevent other Catherines from suffering, showing the truth that charm hides. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing good or just feeding my own grief." "You saved me," Jacob said firmly. "I know that now. You saved me from becoming something worse, and maybe—" He hesitated, then continued, "Maybe in saving me, you honored her memory better than any statue in a cathedral ever could." The old poet's tears fell freely now. "I'd like to see the church," he said. "I'd like to see what happened after I left." Jacob walked with him through the town, and people recognized Silas and watched with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They entered the Church of the Sacred Promise together as the evening shadows grew long. The carved face was there, unchanging as always, but something was different. At some point, someone had placed placed flowers beneath it, fresh ones that were replaced weekly. "Who does that?" Silas asked, pointing to the flowers. "Sarah," Jacob said. "My wife. She says every transformation deserves to be honored." They stood together in the candlelight, looking at the stone face that had changed everything. Finally Silas spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I've carved 100 faces in stone over my lifetime. Kings, saints, heroes, but I think this might be the most important one, not because of what it showed, but because of what it inspired." He turned to Jacob, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. "My Catherine would have liked you. The you that you've become. She believed people could change, even when I didn't. She believed in redemption, right up until the end. I'd forgotten that, until now." Jacob covered the old man's hand with his own. "Stay," he said. "Stay in Redemption Creek. Let us take care of you the way you took care of me." And Silas Moreland, the wandering poet who'd carried his grief and guilt across a continent, who'd revealed truths in stone to prevent the sins of the past from repeating, agreed. He lived in a small room behind the church for his remaining years, and the children from Sarah's school would visit him, bringing him food and listening to his stories about Catherine, about Europe, about the transformative power of seeing ourselves clearly. When Silas passed peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, the town buried him with honors in the cemetery on the hill, and on his gravestone, by Jacob's request, they carved not his accomplishments or titles, but simply, "He showed us truth. We chose what to do with it." The face in the church wall remained, as permanent as stone can be. It's still there today, more than a century later, in what's now a historical landmark. People come from all over to see it, to hear the story of the cruel man and the poet, of judgment and redemption, of the price of truth and the reward of transformation. But those who know the full story don't look just at the carving. They look at what surrounds it, the thriving town that grew from those difficult beginnings, the school that still stands and bears Sarah Thornhill's name, the legacy of second chances and hard-won change that Jacob and Silas created together, one through revelation and one through reformation. Because that's the real story that the stone tells, if you know how to read it. Not just that we can be judged by our worst selves, but that judgment doesn't have to be the end. It can be the beginning, the first chisel mark in reshaping ourselves into something better, something true, not just to what we are, but to what we can become. And sometimes, late at night when the church is empty and moonlight streams through the windows, people swear they can see something in that carved face that wasn't there before. Not a change in the stone. Stone doesn't change, but a different truth revealed by different light, that beneath the cruelty, beneath the coldness, there was always the potential for something better, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right revelation to bring it forth. Jacob Thornhill mocked a drunk poet in a saloon, and the next morning found his face carved in stone for all to see. But that wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of the only one that really mattered. The story of what comes after the truth is revealed. The story of what we do when we can't hide anymore. The story of redemption, written not in stone, but in choices made day after day to be better than what we were. And that story, unlike the stone, never ends. It echoes through generations, reminding us all that we are not defined by our worst moments, but by what we do with them. That truth, while painful, is also liberating. That shame can be the beginning of grace. And that sometimes the cruelest mercy is to show someone exactly who they are, because only then can they choose to become who they should be.